This is the session that is looking at the tension between the situation of permanent crisis that our societies are living in and the necessity to also look at kind of a plan for transformation. So you've arrived at the right space if that's what you were looking for. I'm Sébastien Treyer. I'm the director of IDRI, the Institute for Sustainable Development and International Relations. Let me say a few words of introduction to the session while more people might be connecting. So this session is co-organized by CERI, the Research Center on International Relations at Sciences Po Paris and IDRI. We are the Paris hub of the Earth System Governance Network, and my colleague Carola Kluck from Sciences Po is here on the panel. We'll be speaking on the panel, and so we are the two coordinators of the Paris hub of the Earth System Governance Network. It's good to have you all around this virtual table. We have an eminent a series of eminent panelists that have accepted to discuss this question that I must confess was initially started by a conversation I had last year with Chantal Naidoo, who's on the panel also. Let me give a few words of introduction of what is the question that is at the heart of this session from my perspective. And of course, the whole session is about discussing both the diagnosis or the assumptions that underlie this session, but also what we can do about it. The first assumption that I want to mention is that we talk a lot about polycrisis, about states of permanent crisis that our societies and the whole planet is going through. And I think this idea that our societies have to live in a permanent state of crisis, that crisis follow crisis, and that is actually maybe even accelerating, is something that, to my standards, challenges quite fundamentally a lot of work that think tanks like IDRI have been doing on trying to plan for the transformation to sustainability. I think one of the key crises that we might also want to discuss, and that's again an assumption that the panelists and the audience might want to challenge, is that one of the key crises is actually the degradation in our societies of the social bonds, of the social contract, and of institutions that enable our societies to negotiate change, to even discuss a political project for the future. And that's something that is, I believe, something that I can talk about from France. So it's not just degradation in some societies, but in the countries where I live. And so I'm happy to not just say that it's the same in every other country, but that we might want to discuss that. And it's also something that is not just within countries, but also between countries, as I see the negotiations on the Summit for the Future in New York. There was this not contradiction, but this coexistence of a strong support for Agenda 2030, particularly by the African region that was supporting that strong political statement against the amendment by the Russian Federation. But at the same time, we see also how polarized every conversation is at the international scale. In the field of global environmental governance, but in particular also outside of it, particularly on military and security issues. So that's the basic assumption that we want to discuss. To what extent do we need to take into account not a building up of institutions, but a kind of a degradation of the institutions that enable negotiations? While what I think is something that would be necessary is being able to establish a collective plan for transformation, a plan not necessarily in terms of administrative planning, but some kind of a vision and a collective strategy for transforming our economic models, our economic sectors, and the very structure of the economic systems to stay within planetary boundaries. And that necessitates a lot of political discussion, political agreement, and capacity to look into the longer term future. One of the key elements that I see emerging is, for instance, in the discussion on the reform of the international financial architecture, there is a lot of conversation around what is called country platforms that are at the heart of them is the capacity for a society to make an investment plan for the long-term future that could aggregate all the funders in domestic or international, public or private, around the plan for transformation. But how do we do that if actually the agreements that we obtain politically are not very strong, not solid, or if they are not standing over? That's not going to be very attractive for investors if they don't know if that's going to stand. So just that was quite a long introduction, but it was also a way for the participants to come. Let me present the panelists that have accepted to discuss in this panel. We have the pleasure to have with us Asa Persson. Asa is the research director at the Stockholm Environment Institute, and as you will see on the questions that I have for her, she also heads she's the chair of the Committee on the Climate Policy for Sweden, and was also a member of the expert group on the Global Sustainable Development Report 2023. Thank you, Asa, for being with us. We also have with us Chantal Naidoo. Chantal is the head of the think tank based in South Africa called Rabia Transitions. And Chantal has a long expertise in finance, in climate finance, both in the private and the public sector, like the Development Bank of South Africa, but also having advised the Presidential Commission on Climate in South Africa. Thank you, Chantal, for accepting this invitation. We also have with us Kartik Ganesan. Kartik is the Director for International Partnerships at the Center for Energy, Environment and Water in Delhi, one of the key think tanks globally, but also nationally in India on these issues of sustainability. Kartik, thank you very much. You have an expertise in energy transition, and that might be quite useful for us to also understand your point of view on that. And the last panelist is Carola Kluck. Carola, thank you for being with us. Carola is a professor at Sciences Po. Her research is specifically on global climate governance, if I may say so, but in particular the situation and agency of small island states and vulnerable countries, and how they can be better heard or also find their way in this complicated international negotiations that have a lot of impact, or should have a lot of positive impact for them, but not sure that this is always the case. Thank you for having accepted this invitation. For the audience, we will have 3 rounds of questions, and then I will open up for the conversation with the audience. So please, when you have questions, use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and I will give you the floor, or try to cluster the questions if there are too many questions. So my first round of questions would be around the fact, trying to establish what are the institutions and capacities that we need in our societies or between our societies if we want to plan for the transformation, for the sustainability transformation. And so, Asa, in the Global Sustainable Development Report that you've contributed to, I think there are lots of capacities and institutions that you mentioned that we need to develop and nurture. How do you think we could, or how do you intend those? Could you tell us a little bit more about those capacities and institutions, and how, in that report, you suggested that we could facilitate some kind of institution building or capacity building for societies to be able to plan that transformation?
Yes, thank you, Sebastian, and good morning to all the panelists and audience. Great to be here. I first want to say I think to transform societies, we of course need action, not just plans. It seems that, agreeing on the need to make a plan is the low-hanging fruit of international negotiations in a period of really tough geopolitical situation and a lot of polarization between countries and also between people. So plans, yes, we need them, but more than that, we need action, of course. I just want to flag that in the Global Sustainable Development Report, we also talk about these 6 entry points for transformation, and there you will find, quite unsurprisingly, how we need to transform our food systems, energy systems, urban planning, and so on, and also our how do we create more just and sustainable economies, more circular economies, but also more just economies that address inequality. So, and under these 6 entry points, you will further find key measures. I think we call them interventions in the report, and actually there was a strong demand from the UN and people we spoke to kind of, are there these sort of very sharp, specific interventions that we can recommend to countries to take? But having, a year after this report, I really think we're talking about reforms. This is about fossil fuel subsidy reform. It's about tripling investment in agriculture. It's about universal health access, universal social insurance. These are reforms that have taken many countries, including Sweden, France, decades to agree on. So I just want to be intellectually honest here and say that we really need these reforms rather than sort of any idea of simple interventions. But let me come back to your question, Sebastian, about the plans and how do we build these institutions and capacities, because you are right. That was the main, I think, one of the main messages of the GSDR, that we need to see this action on the actual systems in society, but we could also see this need for cross-cutting capacities. So we identified 5 or 6 of them. First one is actually foresight, long-term planning. And this is a message we heard again now at the Summit of the Future. And I think it's important here to distinguish between foresight, which is, I think, more and more countries are doing, both kind of in a public way, but also, of course, it's a big part of the heightened sort of security awareness. So I think probably a lot of foresight goes on, behind closed doors. But of course, that will not mean that you automatically get a long-term plan. And a long-term plan, in order to be effective, needs a lot of buy-in from the stakeholders and the people who have the power and the means to actually implement it. So there, I think still a lot can be done in many parts of the world to actually commit to long-term plans. Then we have a set of capacities more relating to how do we set off on these S-curves of transformation. And so here we talk about things like how can societies build capacities to nurture innovation and de-risk investment? How can they provide strategic direction to multiple actors? We recognize that transformation is so complex. It's not just about a single regulation or a single carbon tax, but really, how do you get multiple actors on the same path? And also finally, comprehensive and sequenced policy mixes. So here I think some quite interesting research is being done, trying to think more systematically about how do we sequence policy measures to build, to prepare, to first have the innovation, the new solutions, new technologies, how to scale them, how to also build that social acceptance and kind of anticipate resistance in different groups. And this has been applied to, for example, the food system. How do we transform towards more plant-based diets, for example? So we need more capacities to plan. We need more capacities to actually act and set off on this S-curve, but we also need capacities to resolve conflict along the way. So we talk about negotiation capacities, conflict resolution. This can happen through the judicial system in the courts, but maybe more productively, can we find new mechanisms of conflict resolution that address issues before they come, legal cases, whether it's location of wind power parks or opening new mines, things like that, and also more effective ways of public engagement. So these are some capacities we discuss in the report. This is seemed to have landed pretty well, actually, something that member states were interested in hearing more about. They are not entirely new, and many countries have had, over time, the interest in foresight has really it has been there in the past, and maybe depending a little bit on the status of crisis in the world, and this feeling of how you need to prepare. So I will just say, I think what we need to do now is to have more consistency in these efforts, not to build up strong mechanisms and institutions for doing foresight, long-term planning in a consistent way. And also, what I see now in the policy discourse, this will be my final point here, when I look at EU climate policy, which I'm now engaging more with for the Swedish Climate Policy Committee, it seems that now policymakers are interested in building in more kind of ideas around robustness. So, okay, you can have a long-term plan, but how do you actually, what kind of mechanisms will you have in order to, what's the word? For the plan to be resilient to crisis, whether it's something to do with the cost of living or some security situation. And I think that's exactly the kind of foresight you need. So you can't really you can't sort of stop or pause a transformation because you have a sort of barrier, but really clever planning, maybe there's a price mechanism that will allow you to keep working towards a long-term target, but being able to act on crisis as well. So I think consistency and robustness for me are kind of keywords.
Thank you very much, Asa. That was very, very concise for the whole report that you worked on. Thank you so much for that. Chantal, I wanted to turn to you because you have had the experience of the I was referring to the way South Africa has negotiated its energy transition plan. That was then the object also of negotiations with northern countries or Western countries on the JETP, the Just Energy Transition Partnerships. But I'm actually really interested in the phase where among South African players, there was this understanding that we could plan into the future an energy transition. What in that case that you have observed, would you describe what were the institutions and capacities that were critical for such an exercise to be enabled or also then to be implemented? But I'm happy to see how you would frame that.
Thank you, Sebastian, and great to be on the panel with everybody and also everybody online. Thank you for joining. If I can maybe offer first, Sebastian, a less romantic idea of South Africa's just energy transition planning. The background, we've had an energy crisis in South Africa for a really long time. And I mean, this dates back. I think Eskom and South African energy situation is probably one of the most well-documented stories globally, certain from the Global South perspective. So the capacities, to answer that part of the question, the capacities and processes have actually been long in the making. So the process leading up to the JETP was probably more of a consolidation of different kind of efforts, over a very long period of time. We've got, in as much as there's criticism leveled against the likes of our energy company, Eskom, there's a lot of really critical capacities that exist in the institution, very knowledgeable, including at our regulator level. And part of that is a function of our political history, because South Africa during the sanction periods had to be self-sufficient. So we had to stand on our own feet. And so some of that self-sufficiency that comes from more of a historical perspective means that we've got really strong individuals sitting across the spectrum at universities, in planning processes, including in government, very knowledgeable people on the energy system in general. And at the same time, that political history also means we've got a very strong and loud and noisy democracy, in the sense that civil society and community-based organizations are generally aware and concerned about elements that happen upon them, as opposed to and fighting back if they need to, and being very vocal about that. So the energy transition in the context of where we stand now, and the run up to the JP, it really was less romantic than, we all kind of nicely and neatly came together and, put our efforts together. It didn't quite happen like that, as most transitions are quite messy processes. Some of that history is there was some challenges happening at Eskom at the time, and there was a need to try and fast track and front load a significant capital base in order to advance certain elements, but also the most critical element being, in the course of a transition, it needs to be just and inclusive. And the people dynamic really impacted how we actually ran up to the JP, which was then signed in, it was first formed in 2021, at the end of 2021 at the Glasgow COP. And there were 3 sectors that were defined: renewables and electric vehicles and the green hydrogen. And those were, as far as I can tell, those 3 sectors were not necessarily canvassed. Because I know, certain in the prep, Sebastian, you did want to know, well, how did we get to, this process and the elements? But when I joined the climate finance, the Presidential Climate Finance Task Team, that was in the beginning of 2022, our task was actually to try and pull together a plan around these 3 sectors. And there was an immense amount of technical work that had already been done. There was a lot of pressure for external to South Africa inputs to that, but our government was very resolute that we've actually got the local knowledge base that we will draw on. So the plan, as you read it, is very much a constructed plan based on national capacities and the research that's been done. There are excellent modelers in the country. And as I mentioned, foresight, a lot of the kind of techniques that help you to sort of understand what is that ripple effect in society going forward around the plan was embedded there, including just components. So the pros of our capacities in the country and our institutions are that there was a lot of existing work to build on. And again, to build on something, as I mentioned, a plan is definitely not an action map, and even sometimes if you write it, plans are not actions. Actions are actions. If you clap your hands, you will hear the sound of the clap in your ears, right? So that's not what a plan is. And one of the things in working on this that I've been challenged with 2 years after the fact is this preconceived notion that a plan is a prerequisite to resource mobilization and resource usage. And I don't believe that it is, because even now, since in the last year under the G20 presidency of Brazil, and even before with private sector, this idea of the national transition plans being put forward again. And you have to ask yourself, if you've been working in this space for a long time, yet another idea about yet another plan to put something together. Right? Is that what we're really doing? Focusing on, constructing and plans. And you made a comment, Sebastian, which I would like to actually, also just mention about, you said the construction of plans to make it attractive to investors. So we had 5 IPG partners, right? And we were asked, like, you have to put these plans together. We will engage with them. There was a very respectful process in terms of what South Africa put on the table and all of that. But one of the things that we totally got trumped on was the fact that we were under pressure to present that plan at the COP in Egypt. And unfortunately, what that then did was, despite the strong civil society and engaged civil society we have in South Africa, there was a compromise on being able to fully engage on that plan before it went public. And unfortunately, and that's not about capacities, that's about the political pressures and incentives that actually surround some of the support structures that actually, give rise to some of these plans. So we can't answer the question simplistically, like the capacity is critical. Part of that capacity is, I would call it, giving a sovereign, a developing country, the right of the processes that actually exist in their country, and understanding and respecting those processes, and not trying to, fast track it. Because I think South Africa's JP, to my mind, and it's a personal view, has been hurt a little bit by that external pressure, because the CSOs were not happy that they were not, fully engaged. And then after the fact, you're just trying to make it up and, dress it up so that it looks palatable, even though the intention was there. So, yeah, I think in terms of some of the other elements that you asked, I think the other thing that is essential for everybody across the board on, in terms of institutions and capacities, you need national development banks to take much more of a visionary leadership role and like that ecosystem of thinking. So it's not, there is an aspect of the capacities you need, but there's actually the principles and the respect and meta level understanding that this is systemic, that it's a process, that there's not a set group of solutions, because you're embarking on a journey. And actually, it's just like the next 2 blocks might tell you what the 3rd block has got to look like, or the 4th and 5th. So it's that process of discovery. So there's a lot of sort of resilience and mental, adaptability, and a lot of heart in it as well, because people are affected, livelihoods are affected by all of this. And a lot of that is being stripped from this narrative of how do we plan and what institutions do we need and all of that. So I'll stop there. Thank you for the question.
Thank you, Chantal. I was sure that you were the question, which was actually all about this this session. No, but that's really, really important. And I think there are lots of convergences with what Azhar was saying about it's good to plan, but we need also to act. And then we need also to negotiate and to look at the political interplay of players. That's actually what happens in reality. We will come back to a lot of things that you've said. I just wanted to reach out to Kartik Ganesan. How do you see in your practice of policy advice for sustainability policy in India, or even in other contexts with CEW, how would you describe the critical capacities and institutions in society that enable to grapple with this necessity to foster transformation in the longer run?
Yeah. Thank you, Sebastian, for the question. And I think I'm really glad Chantal went before me. I would say India is in a very similar situation when it comes to capacity and the way that it's thinking about the transition. I mean, I think the good part is, unlike South Africa, India, I think from the very outset, probably even seeing the way the process panned out in South Africa, was very clear, for instance, that a jet pay style deal is not something that will work for India, presumably because they realized that, that what was basically at stake when it comes to the finances that were likely to be delivered versus the scale of the requirement. And I think even by that time, research that had been done had indicated the scale of the requirement to actually achieve a full-scale transition over the coming decades was so large that a multilateral development institution or the global north would never be able to provide for any of that finance. It'll have to come from the markets in a way that India becomes an attractive destination. So to that extent, I think the government's been very clear, right, that we will drive this transition at our own pace. What I see from a capacity perspective, and I think, I was trying to think about this, and there was this fantastic book that, Professor of Economics from UCSD, Karthik Muralidharan, has written recently. I'm not sure whether any of you have had the chance to look at it. It's basically to look at institutional capacity for impacting India's development. And in that, Karthik makes, some good points, and he alludes to other researchers, right? And what he says is, folks like Rakesh Mohan, for instance, who's a well-known economist from India, right? He says that the way forward to accelerate growth in India is held back by major governance deficits in all areas linked to public service. So in India, when it comes to, the delivery of public service, which ultimately is, of course, the focus of any transition that we make, because we envision a larger role for government to bridge the inequity that exists within society today. It is about, long-term sustained action. It's not about mission mode response to sort of some immediate asks. And where the Indian government does really well is in acting on mission mode stuff. So for instance, if you look at 2 very important things that got rolled out in the last, I would say 5 to 6 years, is a universal electrification program and almost a near universal cooking gas delivery program, right? You're looking at close to about 25 to 30 million households being electrified. I mean, that's a phenomenal number, right? To get to a universal situation where every house literally in the country today, barring maybe, maybe 1% or 2%, which is still a large number in a country with 250 million households, still lacking the connection. And nearly 10 million cooking gas connections released to enable people to access it. So when it comes to sort of, acting under directive, the administrative machinery is able to pull its socks up and get things done. Because there's a target to deliver, the administrative machinery is focused on it. But unfortunately, to address the needs of longer-term development trajectories in a country where 45% of the country or 46% is employed in agriculture, means that you're looking at sort of systemic reform. And here is where the challenge is, that we have underinvested in, there's chronic underinvestment in the kind of institutions that we have. So if it were to sort of be to respond, for instance, to a COP proposal, yes, at the high level, the Ministry of Environment Forests, there is capacity to sort of pull together and understand what exactly is it India need. And very much like what Chantal said, we've got, the modelers here, we've got a good assessment of the financing requirements, and we've got very strong institutions from the central banks to the, the development, the financial institutions that exist within the country. So all of that is in place. I think what is really needed is to have institutions to think about how we think our existing spending on development needs to synergize with the longer term needs of climate. And I think there's increasing recognition that this needs to happen in critical areas, for instance, like agriculture, where such a large portion of the Indian economy depends. And our focus is less on, to be honest, the marquee projects that the developed world wants us to act on, which is, for instance, decarbonization of the power sector by taking out coal-fired power plants, which of course was one of the feat, in the JETP program of South Africa, which we've sort of at least seeing externally have seen, Chantal, not necessarily sure whether that's the case, right? So India has clearly said, don't come and talk to us about, decommissioning thermal-fired power plants. Our focus right now is to add renewable energy at the maximum pace that we can. We keep getting compared to China. We want to see, how well can we do there, right? And thermal power will make its way out in due course. The economics of it are very clear, that thermal power is not sustainable. But at the same time, what we also see is that the ecosystem to basically manufacture a lot of what is needed is not here domestically. So we've decided to figure out how do we roll out programs that basically speak to bringing in investment to actually create that backward linkages to, renewable energy within the country. And here again, the capacity challenge shows up, which is that the ability to sort of think of what are the long-term trade-offs of having domestic content requirement, looking at this import substitution argument, so to say, to develop domestic industry and learn from past experiences, right? And I think that is where the big challenge is. And more importantly, in the international front, and I understand that that's, of course, an important ask here, is our inability to sort of come together as countries to look at not just, inward looking policies, but looking at it as, India plus many, or, how do we take along others in this process, right? Everybody wants to bring all the capacity within, right? To maybe whether it's to counter a China, right? Or whether it's to counter any one large player. But how do we look at this as us doing things together? Right? Because the narrative every time is, why don't you buy from us? Why don't you sort of, end up having us as a predominant supplier? And I think that is the narrative that needs to be sort of taken head on. How do we do this together, wherein the supply chain is distributed among different countries, that the investments actually then find their way into the most competitive options that exist in different parts of the world? And how do we build that capacity? It can't be just about the prosperity of one side of the world at the cost of another. And I think that is where, being able to articulate that to the outside world and not sort of being caught up in this narrative of, India needs to have all of that capacity within, is that sort of, chicken and egg situation. As a result, it's also sort of strangling our ability to sort of be able to bring on board faster renewable energy capacity. We're left with narratives that say, wait for domestic panels to come. At the same time, we know that we just cannot compete at the costs that China is manufacturing at. And I think this is a problem that the US has as well seen. So, I hope, this kind of gave you a sense of where the challenges that we are sort of really struggling and looking to address. Maybe look at more in the next round of questions, Sebastian.
Thank you very much, Kartik. Just wanted, before I give the floor to Carola, that we are going to see in the COP16 on biodiversity beginning next week, Colombia showing that they have a plan. It's called the peace agreement. And so they are really keen on saying we have negotiated a plan. And so it's not the northern countries telling us what they want to fund on forests. We have a plan since we made the peace agreement, and we have an investment plan behind that. And so in terms of sovereignty and ownership, that's something that resonates a lot with what Chantal and Kartik were saying. But then how do we discuss that between countries is another key point that you mentioned both. And in that context, Carola, you've been working with small vulnerable countries. How do you see, probably they have another perspective than the one that I've been pushing since the beginning on, we need a plan. Is that right? How do they look at building their future?
Yeah, it is indeed a very different context. And I think that's sometimes forgotten when we talk about Global South, that countries are very diverse and very different, and they have very different needs and interests. And I think even within groups like the small island states, there's a lot of diversity. And we have countries like Singapore, we have countries like Cuba, but then we also have Haiti or Sao Tome and Principe or Fiji, etc., etc. So I think we often underestimate the diversity of contexts when we talk about these countries. Now, keeping that diversity in mind, I think I'll keep it to, I think, two main points. And clearly, the climate change is a major issue for all of these countries. They're at the forefront of the impacts. They're feeling it very strongly, but it still doesn't mean that there's not other problems in these countries as well, and there's necessarily that strong political will or interest in putting climate change first. I think that's also something that we often forget, that there's also all these other issues that also require attention and resources. We have from economic development to education or gender equality, etc., etc. Nevertheless, I think the small island states are at the forefront. They do have many plans and strategies, and often these plans and strategies actually have been elaborated within the international system and with international support. So in the context of the UNFCCC, with the National Adaptation Plans of Actions or the NDCs. But I think, again, I don't want to generalize too much, but I think in many of the small island developing states, the governance structures do work very differently from Western countries or maybe larger Global South countries. So I think there's many plans and strategies, but not necessarily much implementation or many actions on the ground, at least not sort of state initiated action. So there's several reasons for that. Already these are very small states for the most part, with small bureaucracies and limited human capacities and staff and limited financial resources. So there's also limited room for action, and always a dependence on outside support for any action. And I think there's, on the one hand, that's fair to say, because it's not a problem that they have created. So, they shouldn't be responsible for paying for that. But as we know very well, relying on outside funding comes with its own package of problems. But that's where basically where the resources come from to implement adaptation action and to implement mitigation, etc. And then I think the key points here is that much of these resources and the entire system is structured through states. So the climate finance system is between states, but in many small island states and other Global South countries, the states work very differently, or they don't work properly. We have weak states, weak institutions, limited reach. So I have the Comoros as an example in mind, which is a country that I know a little bit better than other small islands. And here we have a state that is not functioning well, where the state is not really present at the village level, which is the main sort of governance level. And at the village level, we do have institutions, but they're just not sort of Western public institutions. They're more sort of council of elders and different associations, but they don't necessarily receive information. They don't receive funding, and funding, if it goes through the state, doesn't necessarily make it to the village level. So I think that's a challenge for the for this climate finance system, for the support system. What is it that we mean when we talk about institutions? When we build capacity, what type of capacity and where do we build it? And how can we actually build, cross that divide between a state or international system on the one hand, and a type of organization of governance that is very different on the ground.
Thank you very much, Carola. I was looking at the time and thinking maybe I need to put together the two next rounds of questions. So for the panelists, if you can think about how you can try and put together the two. So the two other rounds of questions were actually to question our speakers about how do you see do you agree with the concern that led to this session, that is about the fact that the institutions and the capacities that we need are actually not so much building up but degrading in different societies, the polarization, the incapacity to come to an agreement, to make political arbitrages that last, etc., or to implement or to actually do the things that you've committed to in a negotiation with other players. We saw that in France between the farming sector and the environmentalists, that these agreements or political agreements did not last. I was going, and the second, the last round of questions were, so what do we need to study? Do we need to help develop capacities of research for building the plan, the foresight capacity, etc., or do we also need to stand by the people who try and muddle through the way that they survive in those permanent crises? So I turn to Åsa and ask for your feedback on how you see that in Sweden or in other contexts that SEI is looking at. Is it right that these institutions we need are actually at stake, that they are degrading? And how would you say that we need to, what is it that we could try and do in terms of putting our research effort towards not only building the plan, but also looking at other things?
Yeah, it's a great question, a big question. So actually, I think my first response is I would just not buy into this, statement that our institutions are generally degrading. I think we would benefit from a much more granular discussion and empirically informed. Our brains are actually trained to, see problems rather than things that are working well. So we just need to put in some extra effort in trying to have a very, fact-based, I think, view which particular institutions are degrading, and in what way, and where, and how, and so on. But yes, I think, if I speak for a country like Sweden, yes, I think that capacity for negotiation and sort of agreements between different key actors in society is not what it used to be. In the whole modernization of Sweden, that post-war welfare era, when our industry was really kind of built up, and we had started generating a lot of export revenues, it was all based on that corporatist model: the state, capital, workers, the trade unions, the industrial leaders, and the government came together, probably behind closed doors and not in a very, inclusive, consultative way, but, it was effective for sure to agree on these kind of long-term frameworks, stability, so that kind of enabled a lot of economic development at the time. What we have now is much more political polarization, and I know Sweden is, far from unique in that way. So we see it's much more difficult for our parties, and we have 7 in parliament, to come together and agree on a cross-party plan that will stick through elections, through terms of office. So I think, and that is what industry is calling for, really. So I don't know how to turn that around, but what we can definitely see very clearly now, and also with the 2030 target deadline coming up so soon, is that the 4-year terms of office we have are really, it's a fact. I'm not saying we should abandon our democratic system, but it's really difficult to have these constant changes, and you have maybe a new coalition of parties entering parliament. They need to negotiate their approach, and just when they are about to deliver, we have a new election. So that sort of delay in the system is really difficult now, and it is materializing. So yeah, in terms of the solution here, some way of generating these sort of broad political agreements, I think would be definitely an enabler And just a very brief comment. I thought it was incredibly interesting to listen to Chantal and Kartik and Carola on from their perspectives, and just to say also in SEI's research, for example, when it comes to finance for development or finance for sustainable development, we have really shifted our research approach from sort of looking at this from the top down, you know, Bridgetown agenda, how do we reform the international financial architecture, to really taking much more of a bottom-up perspective, and how do we better generate demand for finance, and sort of how do these institutions in these countries enable or disable these investment flows. Finally, a very general comment, I think, on you know, research and speaking to the Earth System Governance research community. I think, and I've been saying this for some time, I really think we need more kind of evaluation research. What actually works? Maybe this, you know, maybe this is not the time for the kind of new conceptual frameworks necessarily, but really, you know, what empirical research, what is working, what is best practice, and actually also some research on successful examples to learn from. And I'm glad that the IPCC seems to be partly going this way. They are doing a lot more kind of training on systematic review, more evaluation. Was recently an interesting paper in Science published where they really evaluated what has been effective climate policy mixes over a long period of time in many countries. So that's where I would like to see the research community go. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Åsa. And I think I forgot to mention that you are also one of the key personalities in the steering committee of your system governance, if I'm not mistaken. I might be mistaken about the wording, or you were.
I passed the torch on to a really
okay. Thanks. No, that's also important to know that you're also part of that conversation about what should be the agenda for research of our community. Chantal, as I mentioned at the beginning, we had this conversation 1 year ago where you told me we are talking a lot about many plans, etc., in global context, but actually we might need to be closer to those who invent the future at grassroots level. I mean, I'm probably, you're not translating very well your question at that time, but that triggered a lot of the conversation today about what is it that we need to foster in societies, and how can we think tanks or researchers do. I mean, I'm being a think tank based in Paris, working on Brussels and international context. I'm often questioned by students about, well, are those the places where change is going to happen, or should we work rather closer to the ground? And what could that mean? So you don't need to answer my students' question, but rather from your perspective, how do you characterize what you see in the South African society as problems or issues about the capacity to negotiate agreements, and how would you give your perspective on what should be the research support to these societies that need to change and try to change?
Thank you, Sebastian. For me, there's a fundamental breakdown of trust between institutions, between governments, between private sector, between civil society, between communities, and there's layers of civil society, right? There are people that are working with, and then there are those who are really close, and they understand best what's happening on the ground. And I think that, so the one thing about that fundamental breakdown of trust, so for me, the way that we've been trying at Rabia to bring about maybe foster greater trust is to rather, we as researchers, sometimes we focus on this nice big report, and this wow moment of getting, as much research, getting the methodology right, getting all of these bits and bobs right. And it's a wonderful intellectual exercise that makes you feel absolutely fantastic, but a lot of that has been empty. And that's what it's sort of where I've come to at the moment, is that the magic is in the conversations with people. I think that, but sometimes they're not prepared to have an informed conversation. So one of the spaces, I think, deep research, and it's not so much research, but it's making the research we have done accessible to those who should be part of a conversation in line with, to contribute. because often those that are marginalized by information, access and quality of data are also the very same communities that are then engaged by policymakers and funders and project developers to then pursue a certain course. But if you're not informed and empowered with what you need to know, and what the quality of that proposition is, then you're not really at the table. A lot of these things are just being rubber stamped. And that's what I've observed. There's a lot of like packaging of nice policy options, packaging of all of the pretty pictures of, scenario analysis and all of that. And I've been personally challenged. You cannot go into a community with nice graphs. You can't go into a community with, pretty pictures of whatever has to be said, because at community level, people ask very basic questions. How is this going to change my life tomorrow because my husband lost his job, or I've lost my job? I can't feed my child because a plant has been decommissioned, or the mine has closed down. And when you think about what people are fighting for, they're actually fighting for their dignity. Everybody's got a right to a thriving livelihood, a dignified lifestyle. And the processes that around the energy transition, forget about the just part, but they're really not dignified. A lot of ideas are being put to those communities. So in that sense, I also don't believe, I think part of the prep for this was also asking that degraded and degrading type of institutions. And similar to what Asa mentioned, I don't think it's as simplistic as that. I think globally what we are seeing is, maybe if I use the word breakdown, a breakdown of the preconceived ideas of what global north would do, what global south would do, the stability, the polarities that are shifting in terms of power dynamics. We're actually living to the name of the session in terms of permanent crises. We're living in a time of immense volatility and change. And our thinking processes are very reductionist and mechanistic in some respects, as opposed to understanding. And I think that to Carola's work, which I really applaud, I think working I've had some small exposure to small island development states. And what I find really fascinating is they're not, from my experiences anyway, they don't try and fix everything, right? They don't need to have perfect information, right? There's an appreciation that, because they're living in the heart of volatility, more than anybody else, they've had to fight food security, energy security, all of those elements. And they try and innovate where they are, using what's around them and the partnerships that they are, without losing their sovereignty and dignity in some way. But at the same time, they're also second citizens or third citizens at the bigger table. So there's some real awful realities that we're facing. And as a research community, I think we need to find our activist heart a lot more. It's not research for the sake of it. I think the need for getting to where what I would call first responders, where is the pain going to be felt more, and how do you empower them to also construct their own kind of response strategy, and resilience strategy. As Asa mentioned, a lot of the conversations we have is in, I mean, Sebastian, is similar in South Africa. I live in Johannesburg, right? It's a fairly strong middle class city, but I grew up in a province called the Eastern Cape, which is, it is the poorest province in the country, and when I go home, driving to my old, home, you see people on the streets. There's no, they are jobless. The infrastructure is not really working that well. But living in a place like Johannesburg and in our middle class environments, we desensitized to the need on that level. So as researchers, how do we keep ourselves sensitized is another question, and some of it is not just about coming up with the right thinking. It's putting ourselves in a space where we are exposed to enough of the reality that our thinking, when we are able to contribute, is much more real and impactful. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chantal. There is a lot in what you say, from the breakdown of trust between countries and within countries to how we probably need to look at not just the breakdown of institutions, but the whole volatility of the whole system. And I mean, I'm not trying to recapitulate everything you've said, but I think there are lots of entry points for further conversations, including how we can make sure that we are also inspired by those who innovate in the way that they survive to the crisis situations. Carola, how would you, from your perspective, describe if there is if this assumption of degradation is actually true for the context on which and with whom you work? And how would you see the new type of research that would be needed if there is something that needs to be changed in the way that we focus our research effort?
I mean, I think I can only agree with and repeat to some extent what Orsa and Chantal have just said. Well, I think in some of these countries there never have been very strong state institutions to start with, so I'm not sure to what extent we can actually speak of degradation. And I think I would also agree with what Orsa said about the need for granularity and the need to look also at the positive examples. And I think there are very many examples of very successful action and organization at a small scale, at the community level, and not only in small states, but also in whether South Africa, Sweden, or elsewhere. I think we tend to overlook these positive examples. We did maybe also not to know about them, because I think that's also something that Chantal said about exchanging information, sharing information, and making sure that knowledge is available and that we can learn from these success stories and also from the mistakes that have been made. So we actually don't have the time. I think the temporality is something that also mentioned, that's very crucial. And I think this is the tension between sort of a crisis context, urgency, and also, I mean, what Chancellor said about, what is in there for me tomorrow? How do I put food on the table tomorrow or tonight? And in that situation, it's very hard to think long term and think about a longer transformation, etc. So and I think that's a big challenge to combine the need for urgent action, but also long-term planning and long-term preparation. And I think that's maybe another challenge also for action, is that preparation and prevention is something that's not visible most of the time. So it's also not attractive for politicians to invest in preparation, because in the best case, people will never realize all the work that you've done in preparing, because it means that sort of the bad things never happen. But that's nothing that you get re-elected for. And it's also, so you don't see the effects of that, and you certainly don't see it in the short term. And I think that's another problem in how the institutions work and how they, what their political incentives are.
Thanks a lot, Carola. One thing that I wanted to ask you as a rebound question is, do you see that researchers like us can be helpful in bridging this gap between, I mean, that's probably what you said with prevention and preparation, but to help communities think longer term while they struggle with very short term issues or problems that they need to solve. So do you see that there is something that we can do in supporting the capacity to have the longer term horizon in mind, even if it's not about planning and then a plan that would be directly implemented? Is that something that you practice?
I would hope so. That's something that I aspire to anyways. I think that's again to do with research dissemination and this helping and to share information. I think that's something that we can also do in sort of a in this Western context that we work with, because we're very lucky that there is a lot of funding available that we can access, that we know how to access, in which some, many of the colleagues in the Global South, many researchers in the Global South, and there is universities, but they just don't have the same means and resources. And I think that's where I think research can make a difference in making connections and providing information and providing information. I mean, all these research results that are there, they're not necessarily accessible, even if you work at the university in the Global South.
Thank you, Carola. So I have the last question for Kartik before opening to the audience. So please don't hesitate to raise your hand or put some questions. I mean, maybe you can't raise your hand, so put questions in the Q&A box if you want to ask questions to our panelists or contribute to the conversation. So Kartik, from your side, how do you see, would you have something to describe about how you see this context of polarization, or making the negotiation of long-term transformation plans more complicated or more difficult? Is that something that you notice also in the context where you work, be it in India or with other countries? And how do you see the challenges for research when it's research for policy advice, when we are in contexts that are always more polarized? If that's something that you agree with as a kind of a diagnosis.
Yeah. Unfortunately, I don't do as much work, I think, that faces the outside world. I think personally in my role, and of course, CW does do a bit of work along with, the likes of ASA and others, in putting together the international narrative on what needs to happen. But looking at it purely from a domestic perspective, Sebastian, right? Maybe a slight deviation from what Chantal was saying. Of course, I think there is certainly a need for organizations that are in touch with the needs of the community to be able to ensure that the research that's being done and the policies that are being advocated, speak to them. And I think sometimes, as a research and a policy research institution that we're caught between sort of wanting to bridge this gap by ourselves. But the reality is that the diversity and the expanse that India presents, right? Institutions like us are rarely able to do justice to understanding and communicating the needs of communities, right? And the multitudes of those that exist, which necessarily then means that, we are more likely to focus our energy on ensuring that when a policy decision is being made on part of government that affects these communities, how do we ensure that the impact when seen at scale, right, is overall positive, right? And I think what our focus is on looking at the capacity of public institutions to be able to deliver analyses and convincing arguments to the political class, whether it's a submission of a note to the cabinet for financing a particular scheme, right? And to sort of direct those resources in a way that ultimately the entities that work on the ground find enough to be able to sort of satisfy their constituents, right? And I think in this regard, one of the challenges that we face in the country is there is an increasing level of centralization of a lot of the narrative in the spending and the control of power. And this is, of course, right from the implementation of the goods and subsidy taxes that happened in 2017. There has been a sense that even though it was negotiated across the multiple provinces, this revenue sharing agreement, it feels like a lot more money flows up to the central government. And there are these delays in the disbursal, and the central government sort of, in key sectors, for instance, like electricity, which is such a large political tool for, whether it's for currying favors or to, attend to vote bank politics, are being driven by the central government narrative, which in turn is sort of being influenced by a global push for decarbonization, right? So for instance, this 175 gigawatt target, which we didn't end up achieving ultimately, I think there was a shortfall of about 20 to 30% in 2022, was something that, was not entirely discussed fully. And in fact, the 500 gigawatt target that we sort of committed to post, I think, Sharm el Sheikh or just around that time, was something that caught even the Ministry of Environment and Forest by surprise, because the Prime Minister wanted to sort of put his best foot forward in being able to describe India as being an ambitious economy. But going back to the point that Chantal raised, right, there needs to be domestic consultations as to what is the way that we demonstrate we're putting the best foot forward, and not necessarily setting ourselves up with targets that are likely to sort of cause ripples that will then see pushback from outside. And we see that, despite the fact that a lot of states are in agreement with the narrative around the energy transition, right? Predominant states that are endowed with renewable energy, there is a sense that we need more support to be able to sort of scale up our targets to achieve what the country as a whole wants. And in that regard, I think the discussions on what it means for impacted communities, and more importantly, how do we create the space, the financial space, to allow for the support that these states require. And this needs to be seen from multiple different perspectives. And that is where the central government's role is. How do we drive agricultural subsidies? How do we drive taxation on fuels? That is currently, a significant source of income for the central government, in a way that we are leaving more fiscal room for the people to respond, and equally directing the subsidies that we currently sort of are routing to the states in a way that they are able to use it best to cater to the needs that they have. And here, centralization of the debate really doesn't help, because already it is a very centralized system. In fact, India has one of the lowest expenditures at the city level governance. And a lot of challenges that we're likely to see, given the rapid urbanization, are more likely to come from the urban environments. So if urban areas are going to sort of attract a lot more of the population and the GDP, then the decentralization of the ability to sort of collect needs to happen there. And that is not something that's happening. And I'm not sure how that is panning out in the case of South Africa, or I'm guessing, in the case of Sweden or elsewhere, it's probably already reasonably mature. That is something that India needs to, I think, deliberate more. And I think this is a more internal problem. And finally, on the external question, as I said, I will stick back to what I said earlier, which is that India needs to look for credible partners when it comes to how it will be a leader, because ultimately what will work in India will work for a lot of the global south. And I think a lot of people are looking to India for that direction. And I think India needs to sort of show them that it's a joint step forward. It's not that India is looking to go at it alone. And I think the challenge that is presented for India is, I wish sometimes, we were a small state with a tractable population and a lesser diversity. But unfortunately, we're not. And I think that presents probably the biggest challenge for the economy. And I hope, India will be able to show the light for a lot of the developing countries that are looking up to it. Yeah. Thank you, Sebastian, for hearing me out.
Thank you, Kartik. I think you gave us a very, all of the four of you, a very good panorama of the different situations in which you're working with very diverse national contexts, as you just mentioned, Kartik. It's very difficult for someone in France to imagine what it is to govern a country as big as India, and so lots of things are not comparable. But I think it was also very good to see a lot of commonalities between the elements that you brought to the table. Maybe so. Please, I invite again the audience to come with questions if they want, as we've saved some time for questions to come up. But I also have my backup questions in case they don't come up. And don't hesitate also on the panel to react or comment on things that you think are absolutely that you heard from the other panelists. So I just go forward with one first question. One of the key things, and that might be a question that is a little bit specific to the already industrialized countries like France or maybe Sweden. But what I see from the French context is that we have two trends that are not necessarily linked to one another. First, we are seeing the difficulty to come to an agreement in parliament. I mean, we are now in this moment where we would need a coalition government, and what we have is not sure it's still a coalition government. So the polarization in our society is extremely immense, and that comes from political issues that are not necessarily linked to the environmental degradation, to climate change. And at the same time, a lot of the political philosophers in France are saying that what we need now to negotiate is scarcity and not abundance. So compared to the modernization that Asa was talking about, while also our society is less able to negotiate than it was before, we are faced with a challenge that is even more complicated, to negotiate the allocation of a shrinking cake rather than a growing cake. So I was trying to see if that resonates with some of you on the issue about the specific challenge in which we are. But first, so that was a question that was also enabling Catherine from the audience to maybe talk about how indigenous people's perspectives could be taken up in that conversation, and how specific that might be. And Kartin, you wanted to say something about that? Is that right? I saw that in the chat.
Yeah, just that one question on indigenous perspective. I mean, I'm no expert on that, but incidentally, I happen to be in the midst of environmental conservationists over the last 3 days. And as you know, India is a very rich biodiversity, which is, precious to the livelihoods, so to say, of our indigenous populations, of what we call the tribal populations of the country. And there is a clear, battle between indigenous populations, their access to lands, and the requirements, for instance, of this transition to renewable energy, which actually is very, very land intensive, much more so than conventional energy sources were. So while India is targeting, has a very meager target, I would say, in the long run, in the short term, of what it will require, let's say by 2070, we're unable to find the land that is required to even undertake this transition, right, of another, let's say, 250, 300 gigawatt worth of solar, let alone, the thousands of gigawatts that will be required in the, in the 50-year time span from here on. And this sits squarely with what does it mean for the lands that indigenous people use, that pastoralist communities use, for instance, for nomadic practices of herding, the classification of wastelands, right? All of these, of course, are challenges that, I think multiple countries face because, the debate is rarely about some of these marginalized communities, which at the end of the day are some of the most vulnerable, and at the same time, if their practices were allowed to continue, could also mitigate, could adapt to climate change in a much better way. In fact, pastoralists, as they say, are perhaps some of the most resilient communities because of the very nature of the way they work. But unfortunately, there is not a full internalization of how is it that they will contribute at the high level. There is a poor understanding. And I think it's important that institutional capacity on what it means to preserve some of those lands and not just look at it as giving it away for, solar power development, because the narrative is that solar energy is going to be the future. And at this point, as we stand, the uncertainties that are being thrown by the impacts on indigenous communities and indeed forest and biodiversity are, I think, becoming challenges where India will probably rethink the pace at which maybe renewable energy will be rolled out, and looking at alternatives, of which unfortunately there aren't many either. So I think there is a bit of uncertainty in terms of how we will deal with the impacts on indigenous communities vis-a-vis solar PV or wind energy deployment. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Kartik. Just wanted to mention that I've had this very interesting conversation with one of the indigenous leaders in Ecuador, who had negotiated and pushed all her political force into the referendum in Ecuador to say no to oil drilling, because they wanted. She said we need to preserve our livelihoods, our forests, etc. And a lot of the people were now nearly attacking her and saying, yes, but what is the plan? Meaning, how do you make a plan about long-term sustainable development in those forest communities? And her answer was, well, help us first build up our institutions to be able to then to discuss what is a plan when you're an indigenous people living in a forest community in harmony with nature, and you want to develop something that is to have a pathway of sustainable development that is not extractive. And so I think that's a conversation that is going to be extremely present at COP16 next week, where Colombia, Brazil are trying to show that these indigenous communities in the high biodiversity territories where they live, they are asked to have a plan. And that's a very big challenge for these indigenous peoples, communities, and institutions. But let me just say that we have also another question by Jonathan Pickering about, maybe Jonathan, you might just want to come in because your question is very explicit in the chat, but you might want to phrase it out, and then I'll give the floor to the panelists to pick up on any of the questions that we've had for the moment. Jonathan, do you want to come in? And Jay, can you give Jonathan the capacity to speak up, please?
Sure. Thanks very much, Sebastian, and thanks everyone. Really enjoyed the presentations and the discussion. So I guess this was just to pick up on the question of what works and what doesn't, and how much we know about those issues. And I was thinking about this just in this sort of against the backdrop of the polycrisis theme, that say a lot of evidence, say reviews and so on about what works might have a fairly sort of linear or straightforward understanding of impact. So, does this policy, which is intended to reduce emissions, does it actually serve its intended purpose? And obviously that knowledge is important, but I guess we do increasingly need to think about, say, the ability of policies, of interventions, of institutions, practices, and so on to address multiple crises simultaneously. And there are probably some areas where knowledge is building up a little bit more about these, certainly in the areas of, just transition, I guess. How can we, say reduce emissions while reducing poverty or inequality at the same time? But that's only one sort of element of kind of intersecting crises. Are there other areas perhaps where we need to know more about how our policies and so on can simultaneously address multiple crises? I see from Karthik you have a
Yes.
response here.
Yeah.
Yes, fantastic, which I will read now. So thank you very much.
But Karthik, you might come in also, and I mean, thanks for writing, but just giving the floor, the possibility to other panelists to come in on either of the indigenous people's questions or Jonathan's question on how do we evaluate, or does anyone want to come in? I don't know. Looking at Asa, please.
I can try. Really good questions. Starting with Jonathan's question, just a very practical example is that in the Swedish Climate Policy Council, we try to be fairly well-rounded in our evaluation of Swedish climate policy, because that's our mission is both to give science-based advice, but also to evaluate, do an independent evaluation. And so our kind of framework for evaluation, we have quite a few different criteria. So it's not only about, emission reduction, which is the central one for us, but we also look at these other societal aspects, including is climate policy coherent with other societal objectives? What are the distributional impacts? Have they been sort of mitigated in appropriate ways? So I think, you can achieve a lot by just thinking through your, evaluation criteria, your analytical framework. A trap, though, could be as sort of evaluators or researchers that we, put a lot of criteria on the table, and then we start creating this idea that we can have perfect policy that is going to achieve all good things and, apply all principles of good governance and sustainability and so on. And I think that's not really possible. And I think I think this is what I picked up from Chantal. We need to be much more kind of pragmatic, not have these idealized versions perhaps of policy proposals, but really engage in the conversation, understand the political reality, and find a sort of compromise solution that can be adopted and sort of implemented. So just a warning there, not making, what's the wording? Not to make the perfect the enemy of the good. But otherwise, the bigger other question there, political polarization, is it harder now because we're actually dealing with scarcity rather than abundance, as you implied, Sebastian? I don't think this really applies in the case of Sweden, because still the discourse is very much about growth and, how can we make the green transition increase growth or maintain growth, and that's the underlying assumption. And I think we are a geographically lucky country that we have a lot of land resources and natural resources. So there is a lot of economic optimism about the new green industry. Also some recent setbacks, of course, that need to be overcome. But actually, finally, to pick up on the indigenous communities' perspective, interestingly, that's where the big conflict lies for our country, Sweden. Actually, a lot of these, the optimism around the green industry really is gonna create a lot of difficult impacts for our indigenous communities, the Sami communities up north, and there isn't really the sort of meta agreement. How are we going to resolve these conflicts? How we're going to protect rights? So that's as I see, the big, difficult future conflict that Sweden needs to grapple with. Thank you.
Thank you, Åsa. Chantal, if you want to come in, please.
Thank you. Maybe just on the indigenous people's question, I think it's fascinating. I met a young lady at the COP27 on the way back to South Africa, and she said the indigenous people have largely given up on the negotiations. Well, the native, the part that she represented, have largely given up on trying to find a seat at a table that is actually not theirs. What they've started doing is creating their own table and having their conversations and finding that social and economic resilience amongst themselves. And it really struck me that very much, because earlier in that same day, I had met also another a tribal leader, also from the Americas. And she said they're not fighting for the right anymore to be at the table or fighting for the forests or the environment, but they're fighting for the right to fight. And so I think the elements of indigenous, even the way the question is addressed, mentioned, and no criticism to the constructor of the question, address indigenous persons, in the debate. The debate is being held not with, it's like you're coming in and then you give your perspective. If you think about how we actually use language in a way that says, are we actually at the same table? And we're not. We actually, and that's why I've been talking about dignity a lot lately, that these processes of plans and a lot of the idea of a plan is very much, a more developed, and South Africa's in the same space. So there's not a criticism at all. This idea of plans is very much economies that are actually able to do that. But smaller settings, they have their way of planning. We're not using indigenous knowledge to think differently about how we need to build up, the options of what needs to happen. So it's because we have constructed our whole conversation about the energy transition, about the climate response in such a way that the one side has more information, they have got more engagements, and the other side doesn't. The language between the two sets is possibly different, right? But if and this, I've seen this with some of the work that I've seen communities, and when I say community, people working in areas where there is abject poverty. Those, when it comes to a crisis, who are the first responders in any crisis? The communities themselves. Government, local government is not there first. It's the aunties and uncles and friends who can band together and make things happen. And that they didn't need a plan, they needed a set of trust. So we are putting indigenous people also into a space where they are forced to try and change what they have and able to do in order to meet a demand that is actually maybe more of a construct of a planning construct that we have in our minds. So maybe also refers to that a little bit in her reflections on what she just said, is there another way of doing this, and another table we need to set up. We're not recognizing indigenous knowledge in the way we're planning, and yet most indigenous people have been very honorable to this planet, and they've been honorable to each other. And our northern ways, or middle, let me not say northern, I don't know the other word, because South Africa is in the same space, right, where we become desensitized to needs and caring and sharing. We only know how to plan in a very mechanistic way, not in a way that's actually about people at the center. And it's a very technological, industrial agenda way. That's why Colombia's peace agenda is a really essential, component. It's a little bit like putting a middle finger to the idea of what a plan actually should look like. You know what I mean? Sorry, I don't know if you're going to bleep me out on that point, Sebastian, but
I don't have the capacity to do that, but it's not a problem. I don't believe you need to be ashamed of what you said.
No, I'm just saying, there's other ways of doing this. And from our perspective that have always done this, we assume that our perspective is always right. It's not getting us there, is it?
I had a question. I had a question for Chantal on this. If I may, Sebastian, or to anyone else. See, I agree with what Chantal is saying, right? That this is indeed what the process should be. But we also see that it's the withering away of democratic institutions is not necessarily a fault of the system itself. It's also equally contributed by the people having delegated that authority on their behalf to those that are elected, and then we fail to participate well, even at the election stage, but then more importantly after we've elected them. I mean, and I keep asking this question, when it comes to action on things like air pollution in the context of India, as to how many people even attend resident welfare association meetings where you make important decisions around what is needed for your community. When you find that in those meetings, people are not willing to come together to act on something that immediately impacts their surroundings, how do you expect them to come together to impact something that, is at a slightly larger scale, a neighborhood and a city scale? So I wouldn't say it's necessarily just a fault of the politician, because they've also realized that, the citizens have taken 2 steps back as well. right? They've just receded into their little enclaves. So how do we then claw our way back by bringing them back towards, right? Otherwise, we can't blame the system alone for not functioning for us.
Thanks, Kartik. That's a very big conversation. So Chantal, please do react, but we have only 3 minutes left. And I think it's a very important point. So please go ahead.
You create another webinar, we do this again, Sebastian, please. But I mean, it's a really essential point. But I think part of that is like that whole thing, like because you lose trust in the politicians, then you become desensitized. We are in a vicious cycle of distrust. I guess that's my bottom line. And it is everywhere around the globe. You know, no one's trusting each other, and people are stepping back, and those who are putting their heads up are getting, you know, chopped at the neck. Sorry for all the violence on the call. But, you know, what I mean is that the people have just become so desensitized, and we're not going to move forward unless in a way, our hearts wake up to the fact that if Ossa is going to be vulnerable sitting in Sweden, I'm going to be vulnerable eventually as well. We are actually part of the same ecosystem, and we've lost touch with that. So we're not going to wake people up without actually maybe first waking ourselves up. But that's a very esoteric conversation. So, but hopefully it answers a little bit, Karthik, of what you were asking me.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chantal. Carola, Asa, would you like to say a final word from your side? We have like 2 minutes.
So I keep it very brief. I think the local perspectives are extremely important and certainly need to be in the conversation at different tables, I think, at different conversations. So that's very interesting point by Chantal. And the other thing is, and to Jonathan's question maybe is, I think there are many win-win solutions, and maybe it's actually easier to implement methods when we don't frame them as climate policies, but as health policies or as, you know, urban development policies. And I think actually, I think that the good thing about climate change is that we know what the problem is and we know what the solutions are. It's just a matter of putting them in place, and by framing them maybe in different ways, we can make it more acceptable, and then that's also help recreate trust and hope. And I'll keep it there.
Thank you so much, Carola, and I'm sorry for Catherine. We had no time to discuss the issue of reparation, that I believe is also a very important discussion. So I just wanted to thank the 4 panelists and the audience for their questions, their answers, and thank you, Jay, for having been behind us in the facilitating making this session happen. I think basically what I retained from my side, I will not recapitulate, but I like the way that we discussed a lot the plan as not the right thing to do or not the right way to express what's happening. But I think that was extremely enlightening for me on behind what we mean by plan. There are lots of things that are about vision, an ecosystems approach, a process approach, processual approach, and something that is much more messy in transition processes and in policy processes than the idealistic way of how we look at the plan. And inside that, we've touched upon a lot the question of agency, political capacity, actually, and this question of that Kartik raised at the end, that actually citizens are also getting backwards from participating, which we see a lot in France. And that's something that we need to, as researchers, try to see how we can participate to getting citizens more back to democratic processes that are designed for them to participate in decision making. So this is really not a synthesis. I appreciate a lot your participation. This is going to be nurturing a lot of my thinking, and I don't know if how that's organized, but I hope that this was also a good conversation for the whole Earth System Governance Forum to bring those new ideas or important ideas to the community of researchers. Thanks a lot. And I hope to see you soon in reality in the coming weeks or months.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Good seeing you all. Thank you so much.
Bye, everyone.
Take care.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.